Hello everyone, welcome back to Educately Geography. Today we're just going to go over the basic types of governments and economies that are found throughout the world and just define them and give some examples. Um, Here are some pictures of just global leaders. You've got former US President Barack Obama towards your bottom left, and then you have Kim Jong-un, the Supreme Leader of North Korea, towards the bottom. We're going to talk about how different leaders and different countries fit different distinctions of government. First, let's just go over our objectives. It's pretty simple today. We're just going to define government and economy, and also just give and compare various types of the two. I just talked about this. First, we're just going to talk about government. We'll talk about economies later. Um, what is government, you might be asking? In case you didn't know, it's basically just the government is just the governing or controlling body of a community. It can be countries. In the US, you have states. Other places, you might have provinces. You have cities have governments. Today we're just going to be talking about national governments. That's most of what you'll cover about governments in your geography class. And so yeah, what do governments do? They make laws, control spending, conduct diplomacy. They have the ability to declare wars and much more. Those are just like the simple things. It really depends on what government you're talking about. There are many different types of government. We're going to go through them one by one, the most prominent types, and just compare and contrast them. So let's get started. First one we have is monarchy. It's a government that has a ruling king or queen, depending on the gender usually, that usually inherits power. And that last part is pretty key. Usually kings or queens, they don't get elected, but they inherit their power. Say like if their father's the king, once their father steps down or abdicates, as we call it, or dies, they will inherit their power from, their bloodline. There are two different types of monarchies. The first one we're going to talk about on this slide is called an absolute monarchy. That's where a king or a queen is given nearly all power over the government. So they are the ones that actually make the decisions of, the decisions that an executive leader would make. So an example of that is in Saudi Arabia, you have Salman. Um, there's a picture of him towards your right, and then there's a picture of where Saudi Arabia is on a map. In case you didn't know, it's in the Middle East. Um, the other type of monarchy is constitutional monarchy. This is usually where the king or a queen is like restricted by laws, customs, or like other bodies of government, so they're not necessarily the ones making those big decisions. Um, Usually they have more of a ceremonial or like a traditional role. Like historically, they might have been powerful, but they lost their power over time. An example of that is the king or queen of the United Kingdom. Currently, it's Queen Elizabeth II, over 90 years old, which is very interesting. In the case of the United Kingdom, the UK has their parliament and a prime minister that makes most of the decisions. Instead, the king, or in this case the queen, is more ceremonial, as I mentioned. Next up, we have a republic. A republic is like a system in which elected representatives run the government. So you, like the people, it doesn't necessarily have to be all the people. In some countries, it's just like certain, like established or like chosen people that get to elected. But in countries like the United States, it's like all the people, like all citizens get to vote for these elected representatives. They can coexist with democracies where everyone can vote. So that's like the United States. I just talked about this. It's a democratic republic. That's what they call themselves. Examples of republics include Mozambique, Colombia, and the United States. Next up, we have a theocracy. This is seen less often. It's basically where the government is run by religious leaders and sometimes religious laws. They have like their law systems that are rooted in religion. They often claim the divine right to rule. They say that God has given them their power. That's something you see, especially historically, if you look at some kings and queens throughout history. They claim that God has given them their power, and they try to rule, based on that idea, with that in mind, and like with their religious thoughts. That's something that historically, a few hundred years ago, you would see. That's not something you would see with monarchs today, as often at least. Examples, you have in Iran, you have Ali Khamenei. I think I'm butchering that name, but basically, he in Iran they have actually two. They have a president and they have a supreme leader. The supreme leader is like a religious. He's like at the top of the entire government, and he's like he uses like religious laws and teachings to govern the state. We also have the Vatican where you have Pope Francis. That's a more prominent example usually. An autocracy. This is basically just a government that's completely controlled by one person. This can blend in with like monarchies and like dictatorships, where like if you have an absolute monarchy where like, everything is being controlled by one person, that can be also called an autocracy. Some of these terms can be used like some of them blend into each other. Um, it doesn't necessarily have to be a monarch. Sometimes you have countries where an elected official has complete power, or you know, it can be. It doesn't necessarily have to be a monarch. The most prominent example of this is Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Many of you are probably aware of him. I mean, he inherited his power from it's an interesting situation in North Korea because he inherited his power from his family. Both his father and his grandfather, they both passed away since, but they at one point did hold power. Um, they do technically have elections in North Korea, but they're heavily rigged. And if I believe if you don't vote or so express like explicit support for Kim Jong Un, you do get executed or put into some sort of prison camp. So it's interesting to see that. Technically, I don't think he classifies himself as a monarch. I think his official title is Supreme Leader, but that can be debated. You have totalitarianism, which is basically just a government that tries to control every aspect of their subjects' lives. So basically, the news that they see, the things they can buy, the way they act, etc. They're closely intertwined with autocracies and dictatorships. A lot of autocracies tend to be towards the totalitarian side. Totalitarianism is more of a characteristic than like an actual it can be a government type, but it's also just a characteristic. It can blend in with other types. Usually dictators are also somewhat totalitarian because they have to control their subjects to that level. Again, Kim Jong-un is a pretty good example of a totalitarian leader. He basically controls his entire state. Everyone is in a sense, brainwashed in his state because of the things that his government puts out. A less known example is Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea. Um, political opponents there also have their troubles. You have to basically support the leader, and yeah. You also have an anarchy. This is kind of a type of government, but it's like a lack thereof, like a lack of a government, or in some situations where a government has collapsed and there's really confusion over like who's in charge. Examples, this is kind of hard to like argue. Some people will argue that these states aren't um, in anarchy right now, but Somalia and Yemen, this is where Somalia is on a map, and Yemen, where they're having a civil war. You can debate. That's a debate for a different day, whether or not those are actual anarchies. But basically, just know that in Somalia, for instance, they don't like some parts of the country aren't really controlled by the government because the government there has historically, like over the last few years, been extremely weak and hasn't been able to like control all parts of their country. In Yemen, there's basically just two different governments that are fighting for power, and it's like just chaos. There's a humanitarian crisis happening as a result of the civil war there. Let's transition to economics. I like what I did there with that S, at the end of economics. You have a dollar bill with a mask on it, graphs. Um, Basic definition of an economy. It's just the wealth and resources of a country or region. Again, that's pretty simplified, but that's gonna work for this video. Let's just talk about some of the types of economies. It gets harder to define economies. At least it's harder to define different economies than compared to government types, but we'll try our best. So traditional economies, they stick to traditional old-fashioned methods. Old-fashioned in quotation marks because I'm not being disrespectful by saying old-fashioned, but these are they're more traditional. That's why they are called traditional economies. Oftentimes, not all the time, especially today, but oftentimes you don't really have a currency, and exchange is done through bartering and trading one good for another, as opposed to using a national or statewide currency. Occupations are often based on their parents' jobs. So if your parent was a farmer and you're growing up in a place with a traditional economy, you would also be a farmer, and that's some places that isn't always the case, but it's just something that happens a lot in traditional economies. A lot of places that have traditional economies and communities that have so, they use subsistence agriculture to survive. So basically, they just they're farmers and they just really produce enough to live and survive on their own. They don't really buy goods from other people. You also have cottage industries, which are basically just they produce their own cloths, and they can get some resources by trading with those for food. They have capitalism, which is probably the most common type of economy in the world these days. So in theory, it's an economy that's completely controlled by private organizations. I say in theory because it's not really the case. It's governed by supply and demand. So basically the things that cost more and like the things that are produced is basically depends on how many people want them and like how much people are willing to pay for that. Basically the private corporations in this case, they decide the incomes that their workers get, and that usually leads to economic inequality. You might know that in capitalistic societies, there's like usually like a pretty large class divide between like the rich and the poor. Usually the poor happen to work for the rich in a capitalistic society. So yeah, Socialism is probably like the hardest one. Like there's only one more we're going to talk about after this, but this is like the hardest one to define. So bear with me. It's an economy where the capital is owned by the workers. I put an asterisk next to workers because really like a lot of people are gonna like argue that it's owned by the public or the government. A lot of the sources that I've read talk about like the dictionary definition of socialism, according to a lot of people, is that the capital or like the means of production is owned by the workers. So if you have a factory, the people making the decisions and owning like the machinery and like controlling the manufacturing would be the workers. That's what that means. Still, in a lot of societies that claim to be like socialist, the major industries, banks, and hospitals, they're owned by the state and the people as opposed to private corporations. Still, there's some small private businesses, mostly because there isn't really a true socialist state out there. There's always going to be small private businesses that are not run by the state or like collectively. Usually socialist societies, they think that the government has like a job to like reduce inequality through benefit programs. Usually that means like providing free healthcare, free education, like just ways to like help poor people not suffer as much as say in like a capitalist society. A lot of people think that a caveat of that is, first of all, a lot of people who are anti-socialist, they believe that that prevents people from having to like work hard. That means like their motivation goes down to work as much because they can survive if they don't like work hard. That's a debate for a different day, but that's what a lot of people think is the caveat of socialism. Also, there are higher taxes because those programs, they don't pay for themselves. People have to pay the government so they can instate free healthcare. The last one is communism, and also known as a command economy. This has never been, I don't think anyone will argue that any state has truly been communist. That's pretty much a fact. Basically, it's in theory, it's where people in quotation marks, they control the production and sales of goods. Basically, everyone collectively controls the economy. And that basically means that everything is owned by the people, so everything is public property. There's no such thing as private property in a communist society. This means that, like, if you have a house, for example, that's not your house technically. That's like right now, if you have a house, that's private property. But if you were in a communist society, that would be public property. You wouldn't have your own house. Everything is collectively owned by everyone. One pillar of communism is that everyone is paid equal wages, or at the very least, they're paid based on what they need, no matter how hard they work. The point is that like you should work as hard as you can, but no matter what, you get the equal return, or you get as much as you need to survive. Nothing more, nothing less. So yeah, a lot of people have a problem with communism. Again, that's a debate for a different day, but that's what it is. Towards your right, you have a picture of Karl Marx, who's considered the founder of communism. He wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. You also have a Soviet Russia flag. Soviet Russia claimed to be communist, but they weren't 100%. They never got there. It's a process to get to communism, and no country has ever reached it. And yeah. So thanks for watching. That does it for this video. If you have any questions or concerns, just feel free to contact us. If you want to learn more about geography and even other subjects, we have plenty of other subjects here at Educately. Just browse through our site. Feel free to do that. But that does it for this video. So thanks for watching and have a nice day.